Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is Dev Diary number 13, Standard of Living for Victoria 3. I'm very excited for this one. It is a very special one and that is why we don't have the community feedback section in this video. It will be somewhere else, maybe, in a different video, maybe in a stream. We'll see about it, but today we have a big, a long and a very important Dev Diary. Important to understand and important to consider so that we can see whether it works or doesn't. We are going to do last week's dev responses in this video as well, so that is all included. Let's jump into Standards of Living. Basically, you have a standard of living score between 1 and 99. Pops with levels 1 to 4 are labeled starving, levels 5 to 9 are struggling, and then we go through impoverished, middling, secure, prosperous, affluent, wealthy, lavish, and then 60 plus are all opulent, so 60 to 99 are all opulent. We don't really expect a lot of pops to reach level 60, but 60 plus, but knowing you folks, we've left plenty of headroom to accommodate your mad economic experiment. So most of your pops will be between 1 and 60 is effectively what they are saying. Going up higher than 60, of course, does still make sense. If you are a level 90 pop and there's an economic downturn, you will decline in your actual wealth level, so in your standard of living score, from 90, 89, and so on and so forth, but it will take you significantly longer to pass all the way down to 60 and then stop being opulent, whereas if you're just 61, hey, it's basically just around the corner. Going down in your economic well-being. Standard of living affects two major aspects, that is birth and death rate and the pop loyalty. Birth rate is simply the percentage of children born to pops each year, while death rate is the percentage of pops who die. Both values start out high and decline with increasing standards of livings, but birth rate declines slower than death rate, leading to a net increase in population growth with increasing standard of living. This system models that increasing standard of living tends to lead to longer life expectancy, but declining natality. Each parameter can be modified independently by a variety of effects. This doesn't just simulate that increasing standards of living are offering a lower birth rate and lower death rate as well, but a much lower death rate. It also basically simulates the idea that we are in a basic position where on the subsistence farm, population, since you can only sustain yourself. That is your level of wealth, basically. You sustain yourself, you birth people, of course, but they die, etc. But the population of Europe, for example, generally stayed the same. It increased slightly over time, of course, but it wasn't an explosive increase like we have seen it with industrialization coming in. So at the start of the game, let's say you have 10% birth rate, it's just a random value, and you have 9% death rate, so you will have a slight increase. But then as they become, wealthier, maybe, the birth rate drops down to 8%, but the death rate might go down, let's say 5%, 4%. That is a big increase, and that is exactly reflected or reflecting of reality. What we have right here is an interest group. These are the devout people. I assume they must be Christians. We are in this dev diary. We appear to be in the British East India Company, so basically in India, and this appears to be the Church of England, at least I would assume so, or some church, because be fruitful and multiply, of course, very Christian. Or very Abrahamic, I should say. 5% birth rate here, of course, is the increase right there. Asceticism is fine for the few who dedicate their life to spiritual pursuits, but in the common people, the most important value to instill are those of building a family and caring for children. So we are getting this because, of course, the interest group is powerful, and they like us, they are loyal, as you can see right there, and that is why they are in a pretty good position to give us a higher birth rate, which is nice, because you want a higher birth rate to have a higher population to which you can then, recruit them into your army. Now, this is a law, a constitutional law. Women in the workplace, rights of women. It is currently not part of our constitutional laws because it hasn't been instituted. There is a 10% workforce ratio increase because, again, this game simulates both the active workforce and their dependents. And as you go through the game, the dependents will they are earning some share or some amount of money anyway, like child labor, for example, will be in there, but it will be lower than a properly, fully working, in the workforce sorting person. And if you allow women to work, of course, the workforce ratio shifts, it goes up, gives you more workers, makes it so that the household has more income, makes it so that more goods are produced, makes it so that wealth overall should actually rise, although, hey, if there's a bit of an overproduction, the prices for goods may be lowered, and if the prices for goods may be lowered, that could also mean that, the upper class, so the capitalists could suffer. It heavily depends on how you structure your society. But all of this also comes with a birth rate going down. But again, we talked about this earlier. If your wealth goes up, your birth rate also goes down, but your mortality rate goes down as well, making it so that ultimately you still increase your wealth by having more people in the workforce. That is a direct consequence. That direct consequence makes it so that the birth rate decrease here will at least be covered, in a substantial way, or maybe even more than covered. That is, of course, something that I don't know the exact numbers. We can't currently enact this because we haven't, I would assume this is an invention, basically the invention of the idea of feminism. We don't have that yet, and Pops in the East India Company will recalculate their interest group support if you enact it, because it brings you into a different position in, everything going on, basically, in politics. How will we be able to keep the furnaces of progress aflame with only half the potential workforce could take? Pop loyalty is altered whenever their standard of living increases or declines from its current value. Martin will get into much more detail on this in next week's development diary and political movements. So, loyalty to the state basically increases or declines depending on, how their standard of living is. A peasant that is currently starving won't sing an ode to the king. The peasant would like to throw a firebomb. And that, of course, is directly connected. Wealth is a big indicator for your loyalty towards society, towards the state, and so on and so forth. A pop's wealth attribute forms the foundation for its standard of living. Pops can also gain more intangible boosts or penalties to their standard of living from any number of sources. So basically, your wealth determines your fundamental idea of standard of living. And if your wealth increases, your standard of living will increase, but there's more to standard of living. There's many different factors. Let's not get into that because they don't. Pops accumulate wealth over time while their weekly income exceeds their weekly expenses. Conversely, if a pop's expenses exceed its income, wealth will decline. How large their expenses are depends on what and how much they consume, which is also dependent on their wealth. What this means is that as long as a pop's income remains the same and the cost of the goods and services in their state and market remains the same, that pop's wealth will over time drift towards exactly the level of consumption that they can afford to sustain. Of course, as wealth changes, the consumption also changes, which affects the prices of the goods in the market, which might in turn affect their wages, dividends, etc., etc. So, this is really interesting. It is a very clear, a very simple, and I think this is the way where maybe people will see my point when I said professions are so incredibly superior to the pop types in Victoria 2. In Victoria 2, with the pop type, you had a certain subset of consumption that, worldwide, this was basically structured in the same way. And you had something going on there where one pop type is clearly worse than the others, for example, artisans compared to craftsmen and whatnot, and that sort of stuff going on there. And you needed pops in certain ratios. In this one, what really drives your interest in how pops are doing and who they are isn't necessarily their profession. Yes, you need professions, but those professions need qualifications more than anything. If somebody is qualified, you don't care whether they are currently, servicemen. If they're qualified to be a clerk, then they may be a clerk tomorrow and you might need that clerk right then and there. But that isn't determined by them simply being that. Of course, it increases it if you have that dev diary still in mind. If you have a profession that fits a different profession, you increase your qualification progress faster. But where I'm coming from is basically the idea. The fundamental concept of what influences how you feel about your pops and how your pops feel about you is wealth and standard of living. Wealth, again, is just the pre-modifier version of standard of living. If you have a pop that is going poorer, that is becoming poorer, they will lose education, they will lose the opportunity to have certain qualifications, which may even push them out of their current job, that sort of stuff. And we're effectively looking at a point where at some point, their income and their expenses will be in an equilibrium. They will be the same, and that is where their new thing is. So basically, a pop constantly trends towards the equilibrium. If they rise up because you gave them better circumstances, then they will rise up to that new equilibrium until they balance out there, and vice versa, of course. They will go down and balance out right there. This is very, very interesting because you now have a central, incredibly clear indicator of where your population is, why your population is the way it is, and where your population will be going in the future. I think that is really good. That is far superior to what we had with pop types, but that's all I wanted to bring up there. Now let's talk about this income right here. We can see that, of course, the net income is minus 123, making it so that their wealth will slowly decline. And, hey, that's negative. That makes it so that the standard of living goes down. That makes it so that they will buy different things. And maybe at some point the weekly expenses will then actually be underneath the weekly income and they will pivot back to their proper equilibrium right there. What interests me here is, of course, they get subsistence output. I have to wonder, is this, let's say, a farmer? And this farmer gets a direct payment maybe from the subsistence farm that they are on, but they also get paid wages? I could see that. If you're a farmer, you might be selling things, but maybe you're also working for somebody else. There's different environments, different engagements there. I'm not entirely certain. And then the dependent wages are the wife and the children in the household working, again, they earn significantly less because a child doesn't work that much, a woman wasn't allowed to work that much, and that brings us to the overall 4.51k weekly income. Quite interesting. Annual income per working adult. I'm quite interested to see that, actually. So what I know is effectively that this is an indicator for something, but I can't tell you why I would need this information right now. Doesn't make it irrelevant, don't get me wrong here, right? But I'm looking at this and I'm like, I think it just indicates basically where their wealth is going, but we'll probably see more once we actually see the game in action. Wealth has a number of functions in addition to forming the basis of standard of living. A pop's raw political strength, so before you apply, hey, voting laws and whatnot, is dependent on their wealth. Some privately operated institutions, I think like private health insurance, provide benefits to pops only in relation to their wealth. Many professional qualifications also require pops to have a certain amount of wealth. Yeah, honestly, this all makes a lot of sense to me. Each wealth level is defined by a set of needs and an amount of value that needs to be spent on goods to fulfill that need. This value is defined in goods-based prices, such that the need for standard clothing for a pop of size 10,000 with wealth level 14 might be fulfilled by buying 87 worth of clothes, assuming a perfectly balanced supply and demand. If the actual price of clothes where the pop lives is over-demanded, their cost to fulfill this need will also be higher. So yeah, based on the base price, they have this fundamental idea: I want this much money, or rather I want this many goods, and they will still buy it. Even if it's higher or lower than the base price, they will get that. They need that set of needs, or rather of goods. Their cost of this need will also be higher. As a result, cheaper goods means wealthier, happier pops. Yeah, they have a base need. If you make that base need cheaper, they will have more money left over, they will become wealthier. Makes a lot of sense. Now here we have the peasant pop's wealth is low, so 6. And here the basic necessities: basic food, simple clothing, heating, basic items, and intoxicants. Quite interesting. I like that list. That's an interesting list when it comes to the idea of, hey, what makes a certain pop a certain way. Many needs can be satisfied by a variety of different goods. For example, the need for heating requires wood, fabric, coal, oil, and or electricity. These can be purchased in any combination, assuming the total base prices add up to the required value. When given this option, pops will attempt to make a rational purchase based on which goods are the most available, satisfying their need with some mix of these goods, or even only one, if that's the only one available. In this way, an inland, isolated state may not consume any fish at all, as long as it has sufficient grain, fruit, meat, or even packaged groceries to satisfy their need for food. I find this interesting. Basically, where I'm coming from is, with how the market in Victoria 3 is structured, what I assumed would be happening primarily is this idea that pops will sit down and say, I see the cheapest good that is a perfect substitute, or that is a substitute to what I want to buy, let's say butter and margarine, and I will buy the cheapest good. That appears to not at all be true. Think about it in real life, okay? And this maybe makes it a bit less abstract than it actually is in the game, but think about it in real life. You go to the store and you want to purchase food. In Germany, you will consume something that is different from what you consume in the USA, from what you consume in Japan, in Australia, in Korea, in France even. So even the neighbors basically. In Bavaria, quite frankly, it will be something different from somebody that lives in Swabia, that lives in Baden-Württemberg. Why is that the way? That isn't directly because of the price. It can be, mind you, it can be. But that is primarily because of availability and how things work. If you go to Baden-Württemberg, I imagine they will drink less beer and more wine, because wine is the more classic, the more available good, compared to, go to Bavaria and everybody has basically a brewery in their house that brews out of that house and sells it to Bavarian, salespeople. I swear to God, you will never see, or you will so rarely do you see here, unless you really go to a store that, is that way, that is, for example, in a huge city or whatever, but you will so rarely see basically federally available beer. You will just see beer that was brewed out of one of the many, breweries in the state. And I do think that that is quite interesting. I don't purchase beer because it's cheaper or because of anything, right? I purchase it because that's how it is, kind of. That's the availability right there. Now, what they exactly mean with that availability, how much prices are taken into account, I'm not sure. But what we can see right here is that I do think they do go by prices, at least to a degree, looking at this, because essentially what we have right here, right? Obviously, these are the heating expenses of 235,000 Tamil peasants in Ceylon. I am interested in this. I don't think they've confirmed this, but I'm interested in this for one reason, and that reason is the fact that in Ceylon you will probably be heating significantly less than in Sweden. Are there basically state modifiers that say in Sweden the base idea of heating expenses is higher than in Ceylon? I think that it would be cool. I don't know whether they are doing that, but I really like the idea of basically saying, not only do you start the game, much like Victoria 2, with a different society, with different political makeups, with different setups of who is strong and who is weak and who rules and what, how wealthy our population is and whatnot, you also, different depending on, your geographical location, are in a position where pops simply consume other things at a different rate by default. Because again, in Sweden, you're gonna heat more than in Ceylon. It's Ceylon, man. It's so close to the equator. You know what I mean? I would find that to be interesting. This seems to be fairly low. I mean, 10 fabric, in total this is what, 19.5? Something like that? Yeah, 19.5, I believe, is the total consumption for 235,000 peasants. That's not that much, so I'm not sure. But anyway, fabric. As you can see here, fabric, the price seems to be fairly average, but you buy 51.4% of these 19.5 for 48% of the cost. So it is lower than the average price of your heating expense per heating expense unit. The wood, on the other hand, also still slightly cheaper. You can see it right here. The cost is lower per the amount. But then we get to coal and oil, and these aren't really used all that much anyway. Oil is 0.7% of the total amount, but look at this. We have 12.1% of the amount from coal, but 16.6% of the cost. Then we have oil, 0.14, which makes 0.7% of the amount, but 1% of the cost. That is a very clear increase in the price point. And this appears to be listed depending on the price point. Now you can say, hey, the price point is availability. That of course makes sense. The more available something is, the cheaper it will be. But what I found interesting is just this idea that they specifically use the term availability here. And of course it makes sense for an isolated state, but I wonder what it looks like on the global market. But listen, whatever the actual available term is for goods that are fully available and how they make their choice, I think that isn't that important as long as we acknowledge that these substitutes work wonders. This means that different regions of the world can produce different things. You might never touch wood, as stupid as that sounds. Obviously, every part of the world works with wood. But what I mean is, you don't technically have to. If you live in the Sahara, you may fulfill your needs. I mean, first of all, heating, maybe during the night, I suppose. But where I'm coming from is primarily, you can simply be using things that you actually have there. If you have something that is incredibly rich in whale oil early on into the game, you might just be using oil. You might just be focusing on oil rather than fabric, wood, and coal, making it so that you can use fabric for something else, just because it is more available. Again, I'm curious about the available thing, but here's something really interesting. Goods can also appear in several different needs categories. Groceries, meat and fruit can fulfill the need for basic food and luxury food, but grain or fish can only fulfill the need for basic food. As a result, maintaining only millet farms and fishing wharves to meet your food needs will mostly satisfy your poor pops, while focusing on livestock ranches and banana plantations will cause wealthy pops to inflate the price of the available food supply and further impoverish the poor. They would be buying it up, of course. Operating productive food industries that can turn grain and fish into groceries is good for everyone in your country and frees up any available supply of meat and fruit to be consumed by those with a need for luxury goods. So I have to assume, basically, when you turn grain and fish into groceries, of course, fish and grain, you can see right here, they're both equivalent to 1 unit for this need. On the other hand, meat and fruit are worth 1.5 units. And groceries are also worth 1.5 units, making it so that you are more efficient because you are offering groceries. These people can live for more, their needs are more fulfilled with the groceries, just because they are basically groceries. It's processed food. So, interesting as well that basic food is basically something for level 29 and below. I think these cutoff points will be very important for how you play the game and how you look at things, because again, you need to have a certain level of wealth to do certain professions, and that requires you to look at these cutoff points of the levels, right? What is required to have an engineer, for example, that is level 31 or needs to be level 30? What is required when it comes to their food needs, because the basic food needs are no longer, adequate for them, as you can see right there. And if you are in a position where you might have somebody that is wealthy enough, but then they actually can't afford to live on luxury food, you will be having them fall out of their wealth, and that means they can't be engineers anymore, and that means your factory shuts down. Quite interesting. Low wealth levels have only a handful of needs, such as simple clothing, heating, basic food, and intoxicants. The middle levels introduce more refined needs, like household items, services, luxury drinks, and free movement. Free movement, in this case, I don't think it's political. I believe in this case it means, effectively, are there trains? Do I have a car? Because trains, they sell a service that is mobility. They sell tickets, and if you buy that ticket, I assume that basically just means free movement. Really wealthy pops consume increasingly vast quantities of luxury goods to impress and outdo their peers. In some cases, needs appear entirely in favor of more diverse needs. The need for simple clothing, which can be satisfied by both fabric and clothes, will, as a pop is raised from abject poverty, be gradually phased out by the need for standard clothing, which include only professionally sewn items. Makes a lot of sense. This is a peasant, level 6. This is a bureaucrat level 17 because that's how mafia works. We got basic food, services, standard clothing, household items, intoxicants, free movement, heating, luxury items, and luxury drinks. So they are basically phasing in the luxury items until eventually level 29 the basic food will also be faded out and luxury food comes in. Introducing new goods into your market will help you diversify your economy and alleviate the demand on crucial industrial goods. Importing oil, either petroleum from newly discovered deposits or whale oil from the few places in the world that produce it, will cause your pops to buy some quantity of it for heating instead of coal or electricity, which lowers the price of those goods and help make your industry more profitable. Introducing opium into your market will decrease pop demand for liquor and tobacco for good or ill. I think what we are looking at here basically is something that I really enjoy, because what it does is it sits down and asks the question, do pops, even in this abstract, fairly vague market, do they genuinely act like the Homo economicus, so a man, or a human that is truly rationally acting? And the answer isn't necessarily yes. You may buy something that is more expensive because it is more available. That's just how it goes. You may do that, right? And I think that is a very interesting angle. It certainly would make people more believable, and you will see why I like it so much in just a second. Some goods are favored over others by default if available. Once electricity is available to them due to its convenience, pops will prefer to buy it over wood or coal, even if they are the same price. Some goods can be replaced by other goods entirely, while others will always be required to some bare minimum. Train travel can completely replace the need for having your automobile to drive around, but having an automobile doesn't ever completely remove the need for an occasional train ride to see your cousin who lives all the way in Paris. Train rides actually were, around 1900, 1910, they were a huge change to how, mobile, or what the mobility of people was, especially when it comes to long distance travel. So definitely a very interesting, a very realistic angle. Of course, you can't really get rid of trains in full, not really viable, both, for the people that use them, but also for transport. That is always, or most of the time, the cheapest option. But I really want your attention to be here at this idea that they do not purchase in this, stoic, robotic way. You go into the store, see butter, you see margarine, and you're like, I shall purchase margarine, for it is a perfect substitute, and it is also maybe slightly cheaper even. No, sometimes they might just say, screw that, I don't care. What I care about is the butter. That's the feeling that I have. I love that, right? Sometimes you may have a society where people say, hey, alcohol, you can't drink it. Let's take a look at Muslim countries, for example, right? Instead, they may be using other things for intoxicants. They may be using things like, tobacco. They may be using opium. Hey, interesting. Isn't that actually super interesting? I really like this angle. The substitute angle is not just good in how you can approach your society and how your industry can be built up, because it puts you into a position where regionally you can have different things going on in how you want to organize it. No, it also puts you into a position where you have pops that are simply more realistic. People don't always act in a rational fashion. People simply don't do that. If you have access to electricity, you will prefer electricity. I guarantee it. That's where I'm coming from. I really, really like this approach. In addition to these factors, cultures can develop obsessions for certain goods, and some even have taboos they must abide by. A country can also encourage or discourage the consumption of certain goods using authority, perhaps in an effort to avoid enriching a hated enemy if they are producing it, or entice pops to buy something that's heavily taxed over something that is not. This impacts the purchase habits of pops affected, despite this being irrational from a strictly financial perspective. Beautiful! Thank you, devs, for taking this approach. This is actually grand. I really want to highlight here, they say per culture. They say cultures can develop obsessions. I want to highlight here that I hope that it is cultures, but it is either completely contained or mostly contained to the culture within a nation, or within a market actually. Let's say market, I think maybe. If you are, I don't know, if you have an exclave of Germans, as it happened in Romania, or in, Hungary at the time, I suppose, Austria. But let's talk about Russia. Let's say in Russia, if you have an exclave of Germans in Russia, first of all, obviously they are changing over time. They're not like the Germans that are back home in Germany because of different levics, blah, blah, blah. You know the drill. But where I'm coming from is, if they are, let's say, South German or Bavarian, whatever the cultures actually are in the setup here in Victoria 3, if they live there and they develop an obsession for something, or the people in Germany of the same culture develop an obsession for something, it shouldn't impact one another. At least not maybe with a smaller factor where it's like, oh, people that are fairly similar to us over in this country like that stuff, maybe you should like it too. I could see that. And obviously when they migrate, they need to take that obsession with them, right? That makes perfect sense. But I really just hope that it is basically per market and per pop. If a pop that has it migrates into another market, they take it with them. But just because different types of, pop cultures or different locations rather, share the same culture shouldn't mean they will always share the same obsession. I don't think that should be true. It should be true for the market. I believe they will do that. I just wanted to mention it. What if the Bengali were obsessed with the status afforded to them by luxury furniture? This could happen due to events or organically, because luxury furniture is a really prevalent luxury good in markets where a lot of Bengali pops live. No, that sounds like goods in markets where a lot of Bengali pops live. Yeah, that sounds like it's a global thing, doesn't it? That sounds like every Bengali pop, if this triggers, will get this obsession. And I mean, I can kind of see it still, right? But I do wish there was a distinction, or like basically a threshold that it does penetrate a market if, I don't know, the setup is fairly similar or the circumstances are similar. Let's say you have a market in the US and in the UK and they are very similar, and the Bengali both now like luxury furniture there, but the Bengali that live in India may not actually have luxury furniture, which is the reason for the obsession in the UK and the US. Honestly, I could debate about this for hours because I'm basically defeating myself in my head. I'm going, right, there's a difference there, but wouldn't the people in India go, oh, look at that, my family from the US told me, this is amazing. Maybe. I think it's a lesser concern, but I do think that pops, just because they're the same culture, doesn't mean they do telepathy, basically, right? Like pops develop into different directions. It would surely be reflected in culture. But let's focus on what is important here. This is really, really cool. It will mean that when you are the US and you get so many migrants coming in, they will all have different obsessions. They will come from a position where they basically go, hey, in my home country, do that, and it rocks. It's amazing. I like that so much. It will make the actual gameplay differ in every playthrough. You're looking at a pop where maybe this time around in Germany and Prussia we had a situation where they really didn't like beer. They just didn't like beer. They said, hey, in Prussia we make bad beer. We can't have that. So they stopped liking beer. They just, get high all the time, right? That is a different playthrough because you need to now look for a different good in a different market and need to attack different people, need to take over different people. That is a different playthrough compared to just liking beer. I like that idea. Bengali pops that migrate abroad to the US or US, but even if this habit is developed around their homelands, Bengali pops that is it both globally and not globally? Just look at this. Here it is goods in markets where a lot of Bengali pods live, so Bengali as a culture develops this, but then here it says, but even if this habit is developed around their homelands, no, I think it's still global, but in this case it's assumed that they're all basically at home. To the USA or Australia or Japan, will continue preferring luxury furniture to other luxury goods and will suffer financially if the same level of access is not available there. I love it. I think this is great stuff. This is really good stuff. Let's take a look at this. Stats. Turmoil, 1%. They're not that happy. Could be less happier though. Obsessions, luxury furniture, taboos, liquor and wine. Probably Muslim, right? Migration targets, none. Cultural traits, South Asian heritage. Bengali culture is discriminated in the East India Company, and the homelands are South Bengal, North Bengal, and Assam. This is CK3. This is actually CK3, isn't it? They migrate, they morph into something, but they keep their heritage. This is definitely inspired by CK3. I heard about that. I wasn't sure, but this is nice. I only just noticed the cultures of the same heritage. 19. Let's close out by considering the difference between this and the consumption model from previous games. Victoria 2 pops have different life, everyday and luxury needs based on their type, what we call professional Victoria 3, both in types of goods and quantities. Pops in Victoria 2 always strive to get promoted into types which require more advanced, luxurious goods in larger quantities, but we fail to do so if they cannot afford it, since certain advanced types of pops in Victoria 2 perform their duties objectively better than their less advanced counterparts. Mentioned that before, I think, with the artisans and the craftsmen, for example. It becomes important to retain access to advanced goods in order to ensure that your workforce is internationally competitive. In Victoria 3, this formula is turned on its head. An engineer is not intrinsically better than a machinist, who is not intrinsically better than a laborer, and there's no ideal national proportion between them that you need to maintain in order to maximize your competitiveness. The arcadey nature of Victoria 2 has just left the building. Different professions do fulfill different functions, but it's the production methods of the building that they work in that determine what function they serve. By choosing what buildings to construct and which production method to activate, you create the opportunities for these professions, which in turn impose changes to the population. What types of goods you need to ensure access to in order to keep your population satisfied is not driven directly by what professional opportunities you have created, but rather by what wealth development and wealth distribution these changes have resulted in. Big fan. Let's take a look at this. Population turmoil, 1.3%. Standard of living, the average, is struggling, 7.6. Standard of living for the middle strata, number of pops, 450k roughly. Average standard of living, middling, 17.6, of course. Currently, they are saying, hey, we're kind of, you know, not that good. Things are maybe going down a bit, and that is primarily because transportation is that expensive. Build more rails. How do you feel about that? I like the idea. I really like the way this is done. It influences things so differently. But I really want to highlight, what I like the most is all this. I love that. That is so good. As a result, pops in Victoria 3 won't always strive to ascend to a higher social strata because, again, it comes from wealth rather than your profession. Nor will an aristocrat always have a higher income or good consumption needs compared to a clerk. All of this is driven by market forces. A qualifying clerk would gladly become an aristocrat on available land, if that comes with a higher income than remaining a clerk. And this increased income will gradually result in an increase in their wealth and consumption demand, actually adjusting them basically to aristocrats if they can remain wealthy. Conversely, aristocrats don't demote to laborers because they can't acquire enough goods to sustain their lifestyle, like it was in Victoria 2. They would only turn to such desperate measures if they become landless, unemployed, and are trying to avoid starvation, or if by some miracle, taking on a relatively well-paid labor job in a particular profitable factory would actually yield a greater paycheck than their failing farm provides them with. In practice, this means that it is important in both games to secure your population's basic needs to prevent starvation and dissent, followed by appeasing their desire for even more advanced or exotic goods in larger and larger quantities to increase the size of your economy and power on the world stage. But while reaching this commonly pursued end goal in Victoria 2 often meant pursuing a certain optimal population distribution, no matter what else happened throughout the game, the professions of the pops that you end up with could be vastly different between games in Victoria 3. These examples are really good. They will basically put it into words as much as I would put it into words. If you build a colonial plantation economy, your aristocrats might remain as a dominant force by endgame as they were at start. If you're a manufacturing powerhouse on the cutting edge of technological progress, your middle strata pops might come to rival the capitalist class in wealth and power. If your high taxes are reinvested in vast institutions, your power base might be dominated by bureaucrats and academics. If your workers own the means of production, your laborers might even be wealthier and consume more luxuries than your neighbors' aristocrats. These possibilities for diverse pop distributions also result in very different political tendencies in your population, which lead to demand for different kinds of laws. While in Victoria 2, it's primarily the rising consciousness of a greater ratio of more advanced and literate pop types that drives a desire for a reform in liberal direction. Victoria 3's more open-ended consumption model and the diversity of professions it can create could result in your population having very different political desires by the endgame, depending on the path that you have taken. If a conservative farmer becomes a highly paid laborer, they may remain conservative despite being a laborer. If they become poor, they will pivot towards being maybe more agitated, more on the left side of things, because they are unhappy with society. This is why professions as they work are such a big change, why I'm so enamored with them. I know somebody actually said, hey, I think you're overhyping it. And I get that. I get the feeling, I respect it, but I will tell you I think you're wrong. I think this is such a big change. Pops all of a sudden don't act in, this beep boop homo economicus sort of way. Pops all of a sudden go on and say, hey, you know what, I have obsessions, I have taboos. You can influence that as a state. Sometimes it just happens randomly because that's how the world works. I love the way this works. You can be Russia and have a population that remains incredibly conservative, never pivots towards communism because you made them all wealthy. If you can pull it off. You can be the United States of America. You can destroy the slaving farm owners, but maybe keep their strata intact if you then give them different occupations down there that require them, of course, and keep them wealthy because they pay well enough. You can have many different things compared to how you built your economy in Victoria 2. Victoria 2 was super arcadey compared to what we have here. This requires your political machinery to be working in tandem with your economic engine, both to create the right conditions for your pops and to satisfy their changing desires. Next up, political movements. I am incredibly hyped. Let's move on to talking about last week's dev responses. Alright, here we are with the dev responses for the Treasury Dev Diary. Here, Wiz is an absolute madman. He basically responds to a million questions every time. I love it. But let's jump into it. I'm quite disappointed to see how clunky and ungranular the tax rate settings are. Why did you get rid of sliders? Before we even get to the answer, I really want to highlight one thing. People say, they look at Victoria 2 sliders and say, wow, what a granularity. Victoria 2 had the tax on the rich, the middle, and the poor. And then tariffs. That's it. That's what Victoria 2 had. You being able to move this around doesn't actually talk about granularity. First of all, it's completely unrealistic, but that is not granularity. You can differ between who in the poor strata gets taxed. If it's a farmer, there's different taxes that only address the farmer compared to a worker in an actual city. It is nonsensical. It is not real granularity. I really want to highlight that because I think it is one of the weakest points that I see continuously made. Obviously, discrete options, the trap options, I talked about that as well in terms of game design, are clearer than sliders in what actually you get for selecting each level. We don't want players to be babysitting and tweaking the sliders, again, also unrealistic, every single week to get the perfect level of taxation spending because we don't think it's a good gameplay flow. The idea that the government would be making yeah, it's just unrealistic. It's a bad system, I'm sorry to say. I know people love sliders. I love pie charts. I don't think they're great in terms of like information, but I think they look immersive. I love them. And I want them, and it's good that they're in the game. But sliders are simply bad. Sliders are just bad. It's full of trap options that's unrealistic, and it's not actually granular when we look at Victoria 2's system. A Victoria 3 system where you get the 5 levels, and you get the levels, you know, poll tax, income tax, and whatnot, hugely different. I hope some budget options will be replaced by sliders. Just 5 options to manage a complex economy doesn't sound viable. There is 5 levels, but that doesn't mean there is 5 options. There's a wide variety of different income streams that affect pops differently instead, based on your laws, and then based on how high the actual rate is. I gotta tell you, I just think it's a really weak point. I think the criticism here with the sliders, I think it's a point that stems from nostalgia rather than actual consideration of gameplay. Land taxes only collected from peasants. What about the large landowners? In this case, they will be collected from peasants, farmers, and aristocrats. That is what I mean. This is a really interesting tax because it impacts specific pops that can be of any strata when it comes to their wealth. This is much more granular than if you go and say I can enrich all the poor people. Right? This is much more granular. Diplomatic pacts. There are different forms of diplomatic pacts that can generate money, such as subject relationships, but we'll get into that in a later dev diary. Right now, we don't have an inflation mechanic. It's something we think we'll want in the game sooner or later, but likely not for release. Yeah, so we talked about that as well. The treasury, as it is described in Dev Diary 12, it certainly works. It is fairly abstracted. We talked about the black hole that interests go in the last video as well. And I think it is fine because it works. But if they make something else work, I would prefer that. No, you receive money from it only. Right, here we go with the investment fund. What can you do with it? No, you receive money from it only to cover expenses for the type of constructions it may be used for, which depends on your economic system. Interesting. When it comes to debt that the government needs to pay off, will historical debts exist? At the moment, we don't have this for most countries. I'm split on the idea in that it would be a nice historical detail, but at the same time, having countries start the game in a dire financial state may not feel good gameplay-wise. He was asked later, could we maybe have that as a game rule? And he said, I'll look into it. I think that's a good idea. I would love to save a country that has huge debts from bankruptcy, or maybe have a super early radicalization. I do think it will probably imbalance everything, but I would welcome it. Now, the idea of tariffs is that they should be a way to earn money and protect domestic industries, but we haven't actually finalized and implemented them yet, which is why I can't tell you about how they work. Another indicator that this game is a bit further out than you might be comfortable about. The idea is generally right. Thank you for the clarification. I will reserve judgment until I actually play the game, but I'm just concerned that we may be in a situation where we choose a tax rate which is higher than the optimal one, costing us legitimacy and unrest only because we didn't have the option to select a rate closer to the optimal one, especially if options are 5 to 10% apart. But anyway, we'll be able to tell whether that's true when we play the game. The idea is generally that your income taxes, poll taxes, and other such base taxes are determined by laws and you can adjust levels, but you should not be doing this all the time, while you can usually use more flexible measures like consumption taxes and tariffs if you need to make up a smaller deficit or raise short-term revenue. It's also just a lot less important to have an optimal revenue stream due to the removal of lump sum spending and generous loan system. The idea that being able to see through what is optimal and do it is bad. That's where I'm coming from. I'm not saying don't have fun, mind you. If you enjoy that, have fun. But what I mean is, for a grand strategy game, where replayability is such a big topic, where you going in and saying, today I'm going to play it differently, is such a big topic. Knowing exactly what is the optimal move, which you can easily do in Victoria 2 and Victoria 1 of course as well, is bad because it's not actually replayable. You just go through a routine. Instead, you would be looking at something where you say, hey, you know, the optimal tax rate, maybe something else here, maybe something else, but that heavily depends on where your society is, doesn't it? It heavily depends on who is rich, on who is poor and whatnot. There's so much variety in there, so much unpredictability. It's great. This is a significantly better design. I skipped all of these. Are paying tribute and paying a war reparation from peace deals a source of income expense in Victoria 3. Both of these do exist, but more on that when we talk about diplomacy. We'll cover construction in a later dev there, but it does use both workforce and goods. Very good. The US states did. Oh, right. The US image shows the US using taxes, except that during this era they largely didn't till they passed the income tax and relied on tariffs. So I'm curious why they are using poll and dividend taxes. I assume that consumption taxes represent tariffs, but why do they have those taxes? The US states did collect poll taxes during the era, even if the federal government did not. We're also not going to be able to 100% accurately represent which countries collected what taxes and what level, because our economy is not a fully accurate scale model. In general, the tax burden compared to GDP is quite a bit higher in Victoria 3 than it was in history. The same is true for both V1 and V2. But we'll try to have at least a major theme like the US lack of an income tax represented. Tariffs are not actually implemented yet, so that's why they're not there yet. It's actually an interesting debate again. We talked about this as well, that like states have different institutions when it comes to the US, for example, and federalized states and whatnot. And that is not represented, of course, at all. And again, it comes down to the idea, hey, we can do this, but it might break everything, and we would rather keep it abstract. So I wish you could break it down even to states, so that taxes can say, I have no taxes. But Massachusetts says, yeah, no, we do that, right? I would really like that. I don't think it's viable for the scope of this game. Is debt paid periodically, or does it require player action? So long as you have a positive balance, you will continually pay off the national debt using that surplus. Yet again, this is not how it is in real life. Not at all. But that currently goes into a black hole. There's no inflation. There's no thinking about that at all. So basically, this is fine until we get something better, I think. It is because the income tax law, payroll taxes, is a regressive form of taxation. There is also a flat and a progressive tax. Right, I noticed that income tax seems to hit poorer strata more. It depends on how you structure it. Let's see. Right, the state borrows money from buildings reserves. Will the state pay interest to the buildings? Will the buildings not be able to use the money they lent? Or is that all abstracted away? In the current build of the game, interest payments is purely a negative and disappear into a black hole. We're going to prototype paying that interest out proportionally to shareholders, so with any luck, that's how it will work on release. My only hesitation is that mechanics which favor pops at the temporary expense of the players, or vice versa, aren't clearly good or bad for the player, which presents certain challenges in framing, explanation, and game dynamics. For example, a country that's deep in debt would pay a lot of interest to its captains of industry, who are quite pleased with that, as the payments afford them greater luxuries, when actually they should perhaps be worried by debt. The debt will be defaulted on and encourage government austerity and repayment. But if the country manages to climb out of debt, they are now punished by the factory owners, who are mad that their piles of gold are slightly smaller today. It's difficult. This is really difficult to pull off right. It is really difficult to pull off without completely derailing the game's balancing. I certainly hope that they're gonna check it out, yeah. I certainly do. As for the buildings being unable to use the money lent, the way it works is that if a building has to tap into its reserves, if this causes the total cash reserves in the nation to shrink below the current debt principle, the country goes into default. So buildings can still use money lent by basically demanding to be repaid, but while the country is in this state, it can declare bankruptcy on bail, and bail on all lenders. Are there international lenders though? Why is nobody asking this? Anyway, I think that's a good answer. This is a good solution as it currently works. Would it make sense to increase the maximum tax rates to achieve more radicalization? I mean, if it could be a valid strategy in case I deliberately want to create a socialist or some kind of tax haven country, for example. Oh yeah, absolutely. Punitive tax rates on specific segments of the population, which can also be precisely targeted by high taxes on specific consumer goods to build radicalism to power up certain popular movements, is a perfectly valid galaxy brain move. Absolutely lovely. There's so much more granularity in this tax system. It's truly great. I love it. An idea that was floated up thread is to treat the amount of the credit limit debt ceiling a country is using as a measure of the market's trust in them. If you have modest debts, such as England in the dev diary, people are more confident that you will repay them than if you're running very close to the red line. So modest deficit spending might have its supporters among your pops, but if it spirals out of control, they'll be steadily more worried. Look at Greece, 2008. Our first debt model during early prototyping did actually use escalating interest rate the closer to the debt ceiling you got, for exactly this reason. In practice, since compounding interest and escalating interest rate becomes exponential, they had made for terrible unfun death spirals where if your investments didn't all pan out perfectly, all you could do was sit and wait for bankruptcy. It discouraged players from deficit spending, which was the exact opposite we wanted from our loan system, so nice idea, but it didn't work. Fair enough, they tested it, that's what you like to see, and that's it. That's it for today. We're gonna get to the community responses in a separate video or on a live stream. Keep your eye out. I love pop professions. I love pop wealth, standard of living, pop obsessions, and cultures. All of that stuff is genuinely amazing. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you agree with me? I have a very strong opinion on this one, but that is primarily because it is so much better, in my opinion, than Victoria 2. Let me know, and I'll see you later. Alligator.